Okay, so for those who don't know me, my name is Rathouse. I did my PhD examining how contemporary pagan groups interacted with the archaeological and heritage professions over issues including sites, which to the pagans were sacred, to the archaeologists were heritage sites, and ancient human remains, or ancestral remains as the pagans would see it. Can I just remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones so we don't get any introductions? And I'll dive straight in. This is going to be particularly of interest to those of you just starting out on your research, or those of you about to go from master's level project to a PhD. Basically, as you all probably know, when you start a PhD, you have this enormous expanse of emptiness that you have to fill. And it seems pretty daunting, doesn't it? But if you've got a kind of format or a template to help you to plan it, I think it can be very helpful. And this is what I'm going to offer you today. Now, it's not a traditional academic format, far from it. This is something I learned in a sort of previous life as a territorial soldier. And it's called an appreciation. Now, this is the process that the military go through when they're planning operations, patrols, attacks, defences, etc. So the phases of an appreciation are as follows. First, you need to clarify your aims and objectives. Then you need to assess your situation, assess your resources, look at the courses of action open to you, determine what the factors affecting those courses are. You make your choice, you break it down into phases, and then you go into detail of how you're going to execute it. So the elements are aims, situation, resources, courses, factors, choice, phases, and execution. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these now. So your aims and objectives. What are you doing it? What are you doing? And perhaps a bit of a consideration of why you're doing it as well. Now, with my PhD, what I wanted to do was find out how contemporary pagans interact with archaeologists and heritage professionals. I wanted to analyse the areas of dispute and cooperation and to try and formulate resolution or amelioration strategies. So having identified what it is you want to do, then we move on to the situation. In a military setting, you're talking a lot about the ground, situation, enemy forces, friendly forces, etc., etc. In academia, it's worth breaking this down into the physical situation and the theoretical or cognitive environment in which you're going to be operating. So you're looking at dominant theoretical approaches within that cognitive environment. You're looking at what literature has been done before, identifying your lacuna, the gap in the knowledge that you're going to fill. You're going to look at how it's been done, how these things have been approached in the past. On the physical side, you may look at whether your area of research is, especially for anthropologists, whether it's a specific physical area or a multi-sited approach. And this also applies for archaeologists, it may apply for classicists, relating texts to actual features on the ground. You may have to consider which libraries, which universities are housing the documents that you will have to look at. Whether those documents might be available online, or whether you're actually going to travel, perhaps internationally, to get hold of information that you need to conduct your research. Now, for my thesis, I was looking at the fact that some of the people I was going to be interviewing might be defensive and a bit suspicious of outsiders. I turned up at Stonehenge, my second piece of field work. Someone took one look at me, muttered a little bit under her breath, and then came up to me and said, "Fuck off, you're not welcome here." Now this actually ended up operating in my favour, because one of the other people there was so upset that a member of his community had spoken so aggressively to an outsider that he welcomed me into his caravan, made me a cup of tea, it being a very cold winter solstice, and proceeded to give me a very detailed interview. So some of these issues that may seem very problematical at the time may actually turn out in your advantage. Heritage and archaeological professions actually turned out to be a little bit more cagey about what they said. I anticipated that they may be dismissive of a group they see as irrational. In actual fact, quite a few people were very reluctant to go on record saying things that might, down the road, be seen as prejudiced. And I was also aware that there might, it being a rather politicised situation, there may be direct action protests, and I had to consider the extent to which I wanted to be involved in these. In fact, this caused me a slight problem with the ethical committee, such as it was then. I believe things have got a lot tighter since then. In that I had to reassure the university that I wouldn't be trespassing on anyone else's land, and I definitely wouldn't be doing anything illegal. So you've got some idea about some of the factors you're going to be looking at in terms of assessing the situation. Really and truly, resources probably ought to be a subheading within this area. But I put it down separately because the funding that you have, any personal equipment that is available or which you may need to acquire, are going to be serious considerations. If you're part of a larger research project, you might be able to consider what other personnel might be available to you. If you're doing your own project from scratch, then it's pretty much likely to be down to you. So the courses of action. Well, I'll give you an example of how I assessed the sort of macro level methodological approach for my thesis. I thought, well, I can do this as a purely literary based research project. I could do this as a purely ethnographic process, going out into the field, interviewing people, perhaps carrying out participant observation with groups, or I could try and adopt a combined strategy. So those were my three courses in terms of the macro methodological situation. The factors affecting those were as follows. The purely literary approach would favour input from people who had access to get things published and might serve to exclude people who were active on the ground but were not talented writers or particularly well endowed with access to getting things into the press, be it academic press or be it within some more pagan community press. It also involved a bit of a time lag. For something to be in the literature, there's usually a process to get it there, so it's not going to be so much up to the minute. Things are better now than they may have been a decade or two back with the access to the internet, but even so, a literary approach might not be as up to the minute as actually getting onto site and interviewing people. Conversely, purely concentrating on interviewing gives you a very personal impression, but it might limit access to some of the background to things and some of the deeper philosophical arguments behind what's going on. So the combined approach seemed to offer the best of both worlds, and that was why that was my choice. So I broke that down then into phases, and the phases I chose to do were initially one of gathering background information, trying to assess the theoretical approaches that have been made in the past, and understanding what had been happening up to that point. I then started doing some limited field work to just get a feel for what it was like what kind of interactions I would get from some of the players in contesting sites and human remains. I then used the lessons from that to increase this and seek more interviewees, more situations, to visit more sites. And then I started the interpretation phase, where I was starting to sort of say, well, so what? And this is again something that is heavily drawn from this military planning process. When young soldiers are taught how to do appreciations, they are urged to constantly consider, so what? So what? What are the implications of this piece of information? And indeed, that was what I was trying to do in interpreting some of the early field work and in terms of interpreting the written work that I was coming across. Field work continued to be done through this phase, or at least through the earlier part of the interpretation phase, and I also started to do some writing up. I was forced to some extent because of the methodology of enrolling as an MPhil student and then doing the upgrade. I don't know if it's still the case, but I had to produce an introduction and a literature review and a presentation for my upgrade board. So the actual execution, when I started on the project, I was very concerned to be constantly assessing things as I went and to maintain a flexible approach, to be able to sort of adjust things if I wasn't getting the data that I needed to be able to produce a coherent report. And one of the key ways in which this worked out was around the attitudes of research participants to me as a researcher. And it was quite an interesting sort of sideline to the main thrust of the research, to see how people responded according to different ways in which I presented myself. When the young woman told me to fuck off, I was dressed fairly similarly to the way you see me now, wearing sort of outdoor trousers with pockets. I had sort of slightly sturdier boots of a sort of military variety. I had a broad-brimmed hat and a waterproof coat. And I probably looked like some sort of fairly typical outdoorsy, researchery type person. Now, I'd originally intended to carry a small pocket notebook like this, but I'd just finished my first one. I hadn't got around to getting a second one, so I went out with an A4 pad and a clipboard. Now, I maintain that if you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to get into a secure facility for some kind of espionage related thing, a clipboard is probably going to be your greatest asset, because if you wander around with a clipboard, people will assume you're supposed to be there, you're something official. But in my research, I was dealing with people who were quite sort of radical counterculturalists and that didn't really take very well to people who were in any way official. So this was probably why I got the sort of fuck off approach. As a subsequent interview, I actually went in full white robes, like one of the druids there. And the response I got from the interviewees was very different indeed. I was very much treated as one of them, but I also found it a bit harder to actually get any sort of serious engagement with some of the more detailed aspects of the research, and I didn't end up trying that particular approach again throughout the rest of my research. Another part I wanted to be quite flexible on was the extent to which I was going to challenge anyone's assumptions. As a researcher, I was to some extent unsure about whether I should be attempting to change anything that I found in the field, at least not until after it was all completed. Obviously, I wouldn't have intended to create any contestation where none had existed before, so that would be completely unethical. But to what extent was I going to challenge assumptions in a way that might cause someone involved in activism or someone who was a decision maker on the heritage side to rethink their position. I tried to avoid that as much as possible, but in understanding some of the reasons for contestation or the reasons for exclusion, it was essential to actually start challenging some assumptions. And this I did quite late on in the research, and I think it was probably better that I did. If I'd done it too early, I possibly could have put my foot in it to a greater degree. As it was, I did end up offending some activists, but then their position was such that anyone who disagreed with them was going to be on their sort of enemies of the state kind of list. So I hope this has given you some kind of input into how I went about planning, preparing and executing the research. You have a choice at this stage. I can go into a bit more detail. I can read you out from the thesis itself a sort of relatively brief, we're looking at about 4 pages, year by year account of what I did. Or we can go straight to questions. What's the general feeling? All those in favour of hearing what actually happened in a little bit more detail? Yeah. All those who want to go straight to questions? Okay, right, I'll read out what was done then. Now, in the first year of the research, I spent most of the first term preparing and planning field research and also writing 2 conference papers. By way of background study, I attended lectures on ethics with the philosophy department and took a refresher on anthropological fieldwork methods and ethics. I visited the Avebury Stone Circle at the Samhain, or Halloween Festival. I interviewed the site manager and attendees at Stonehenge at the winter solstice. Also in December, I presented my first research paper at the Theoretical Archaeology Group TAG conference in Exeter. During the second term, I carried out further planning and preparation work. This included arranging to attend an archaeological dig and 3 pagan camps for summer field research. I continued background reading and attended pagan events at Imolc, Candlemas, on the 2nd of February, and Spring Equinox. I also began writing my thesis introduction and literature review for my upgrade board from MPhil to PhD. During the Easter break, I conducted field research in the east of England, visiting the Museum of London and the British Museum, where I interviewed Jodie Joy, the curator responsible for Lindo Man. I also interviewed pagan contacts in London, Hertfordshire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. I interviewed Brian Ayres, who had been involved in the excavation of the Seahenge Timber Circle, and visited Lynn Museum at King's Lynn to see the timbers and investigate their display. I also visited contested Arborough and Nine Ladies Stone Circle sites in Derbyshire. Most of the third term was spent writing my thesis introduction and literature review for the upgrade board from MPhil to PhD candidate. I did, however, find time to interview some pagan contacts in the Lampeter area during the summer holidays. I also presented a paper at the Pagans for Archaeology conference. I attended the Druid Network Druid Camp, Pagan Federation Wales and West Summer Camp, and the Lunasa Grey Mare Camp. In August, I visited London and interviewed Sebastian Payne, the Chief Scientist of English Heritage. I also completed my upgrade portfolio, sat and passed the upgrade board. At the end of the holidays, I carried out participant observation field work at the Panther Butler archaeological dig near Cardigan. So the second year, 2009 to 10, during the first term, I continued to interview pagan contacts, attended the Honouring the Ancient Dead conference in Leicester, started to analyse the results of my initial field work and planned further field research. I also gained teaching experience in higher education by leading a seminar group for first-year archaeology undergraduates. During the second term, I continued fieldwork analysis and identifying directions for further fieldwork, as well as gaining experience in marking undergraduate coursework. Over the Easter holidays, I went to London and observed public interactions with remains at museums. I then visited the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff and interviewed their collections manager, Elizabeth Walker. Subsequently, I undertook a field trip which included participant observation with a Reconstructionist pagan group, a visit to Oriel Ynys Anglesey's Museum and Art Gallery, a visit to a pagan friend in Yorkshire, and attending a Beltane event at Thornborough Henges. In the third term, the Archaeological Society organised a visit to the Pitt Rivers and Ashmolean Museums in Oxford, where I examined how human remains were displayed and how people interacted with them. I continued to interview local pagans and to plan summer research fieldwork. Over the summer holidays, I conducted further fieldwork, including attending a solstice ritual by the Cotswold Order of Druids at the Rollright Stones, and availing myself of the open access arrangements to the Stonehenge summer solstice organised by English Heritage. On the return journey, I visited the Wiltshire Heritage Museum at Devizes, which houses finds from Stonehenge, before visiting Ronald Hutton at his home in Bristol. After returning to Lampeter, I met with Rob Wallace and interviewed a friend who was both pagan and an archaeologist. It was then brought to my attention that an archaeological dig had been contested at Nevern in North Pembrokeshire, and I quickly made arrangements to investigate. The problems arising from this field work are discussed later in the thesis, but basically consisted of a certain person putting in a complaint about my investigations, which then had to be resolved, which took several months to do, and I was finally able, after checking with all the major stakeholders, to carry on with that particular case study, which, under the circumstances, were not then completed until October. In August, I attended the Druid Network Rainbow 2000 Druid Camp in Gloucestershire, introducing another researcher, Emily Porth, to the event and to the people there. She in turn introduced me to people she had been interviewing at the Hunterian Museum in London. At this time, I was invited to submit a chapter for a volume on researching the reburial debate by Blaine and Wallace. I attended a meeting about this proposed book, attended by, among others, Paul Davies, Sebastian Payne, Philip Shallcrass and Emma Rastalore, on the way to conduct participant observation and interviews at the Grey Mary NASA camp. On my return to Lampeter, I interviewed members of Lampeter's Catholic community about their beliefs regarding saintly relics, and a friend who identifies herself as a shaman on Souls and Bones. In September, I visited the London museums again before attending the autumn equinox gathering at Avebury, where I interviewed Frank Summers, and then, later on, visiting Dyfed Archaeology Trust to find out about any other work they had been involved in and whether that had been contested. In the third year, early in that first term, the Pagan Society attended a Pagan Federation conference at Crickhowell. I was also involved in writing papers for conferences and chapters for publication, as well as my thesis. In November, I attended the Druid Network conference, where I gave a paper critiquing some of the pro-reburial arguments and noted the reaction. Then in December, I gave a paper at the TAG conference in Bristol and visited the museum there. During the Christmas holidays, I visited the Crossbones graveyard, which I had heard about at TAG. I then fell ill and was diagnosed with kidney stones, which were to continue giving me pain for a year. During the second term, I continued to write and carry out literary research, as well as undertaking a field trip to Avebury. In the Easter break, I undertook first aid and Midas minibus driver training, which were required for the teaching assistance I was to provide in the third term. Most of the third term was taken up with writing thesis chapters and pieces for publication. I also gained more teaching experience, helping with field classes for first-year undergraduate students, learning about mapping out surface features and accessing research data. During the summer holidays, I worked for Mind Aberystwyth in community mental health 3 days a week and spent the rest of the time reading and writing for this thesis. However, I wrote far less than I had hoped, and just before the start of the new academic year, the University of Wales Trinity St David hosted the annual Association of Social Anthropologists Conference, where I gave a paper questioning the assertion put forward by some pro-reburial campaigners that museum display of human remains reduces them from persons to objects. The fourth year, 2011 to 12, most of it was taken up with writing. I completed 2 chapters for edited volumes. One was a chapter on pagan interactions with mortuary archaeology for a book being edited by Howard Williams and Melanie Giles, Incidentally, this book should be coming out this year. The other was a methodological piece for the volume on researching and contestation of human remains, edited by Blaine Wallace. This latter book seems to have sunk without trace. Having completed these chapters, I continued writing my thesis. The summer holidays were spent on thesis writing, with time taken out to earn sufficient money to survive by working for Mind Aberystwyth. I also attended the TDN Druid Camp, where I spoke to Emma Restall and Graham Harvey. In the fifth year, 2012 to 13, in the first term, I completed my first draft thesis and submitted it to my supervisors for criticism. While they were reading and assessing my work, I began to implement plans for the next phase of the career. I received my supervisor's advice in January and spent the next 4 months implementing it. The thesis submission date was agreed on the 26th of April 2013. Now, skipping ahead from there, the situation of the Viva was interesting. I disagreed to a fairly significant degree with my external examiner, and one of the ways in which I rewrote my thesis from the initial draft was to tone down my criticism of his work quite radically. When I went into the Viva, of course I was a bit nervous, but the way I got over this was to go up to the examiners, shake them warmly by the hand and thank them for taking an interest in my work. After this, it got a lot calmer. And the feedback from the external examiner described it as not being remotely like an inquisition, but rapidly developed into a three-way conversation. He subsequently described it as one of the best Vivas he'd ever attended, which I take to be extremely high praise. The outcome of that was to resubmit within 2 years. If there'd been an intermediate thing between minor corrections within 3 months and resubmission within 2 years, I'm assured that would have been the choice. But as it happened, it took me just over a year to complete my corrections. That was then resubmitted and was passed in, I think it was about April of last year. I then graduated July 2015, and here I am now. So can I ask if anyone has any questions about how I planned and executed the thesis, and anything else, any other questions related to Dave?
You mentioned ethical committees and getting permission to go and do research. I'm interested in not so much formal interviews, but all the talks you've had with all these people, some of them academics, some of them in places like this. Do they all need to be accounted for and planned for?
That's a very good point. There's within the decisions on the details of the research methodology, or the research methods rather, I considered what kind of interviewing strategy was best. Whether I should go with fixed pre-scripted interviews, whether I should go for a semi-structured interview approach where I sort of jotted down a list of questions beforehand, or whether I should go in pretty much sort of open-minded and let the conversation develop as it would. In the end, I chose a semi-structured approach. For every interview I had, or at least for interviews with particular categories of participants, I would make a list of questions I wanted to ask. I then went in with that list of questions, but I didn't limit myself to those questions. I felt absolutely free to alter the sequence of them, and indeed leave some out if they didn't feel appropriate. And thus the interviewing process was allowed to develop in a very organic way. Now, at the first postgraduate summer school, the Dean of Faculty at the time said that there were going to be some severe changes to the way in which fieldwork involving members of the public would be approved by the Ethics Committee. And she stated that only scripted interviews with the script pre-approved by the Ethical Committee would be allowed. Now, this led to some controversy, because in a lot of anthropological research, you need to have a lot of freedom to go off in odd directions. And indeed, the whole concept of participant observation tends to be unscripted. You sort of put yourself in with your your focus group and follow on with living their lives to a large extent. So this sort of restriction to a pre-approved scripted interview would actually make an awful lot of anthropological research impossible to do. A lot of accepted methodological practice unsupported by the university. So I was rather grateful to hear that that proposal was being dropped. Does that answer your question?
To some extent. I was wondering
Okay, do you want to
what sort
elaborate?
of thing happens. So it's like, okay, I had a situation like here, or say the camp you went to and you spoke to Graham Harvey, who's kind of both an academic and a practitioner.
Yeah.
You kind of might go with your hat on, thinking that you're talking to a member of the public, or you're talking to a fellow academic, and in either situation, you might get into a conversation where it sort of radically changes the direction of your thinking, or just do something.
Yeah.
You need to have a structure, I'm thinking, to sort of account for that, to allow you to be shown to be wrong, right, and to allow you to do it at all.
Do you need a structure to allow for changes in direction? I'm not convinced that you do. Definitely, this whole idea of hypothesis, antithesis, and synthesis, this sort of academic process of coming up with an idea, testing it, and then sort of coming up with seeing whether that idea is confirmed, denied, or just needs a bit of tweaking. I know that is inherently flexible, isn't it?
Well, hopefully, but it sounds
yeah,
like
hopefully.
This feature's in place, but I don't want to end up doing what to somebody would look like lots of field research, but to somebody else would look like looking at the literature and chatting to the odd person who I've bumped into.
Yeah, so some degree of planning and note-taking. I think it's the key thing is the note-taking. You've got to keep detailed records of this. Now, for me, most of my records were taken, at least for interviews, were kept in the form of cassettes. But I did take written notes as well at the same time. So I was able to jot down what I felt were the key points that they were making, but I also had the tape recording to be able to contextualise something. So that would sort of be the main difference between just going out and having a chat with someone about this. This is the sort of verifiable academic discipline of it, if you like. But I think that's more in terms of the practice of what you do than necessarily in terms of the planning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I still want to be able to have my informal chats and make use of them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Maybe document them as well to some extent.
Yeah,
but, depending on what's what.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no reason why that can't be the case, but you do need to have fairly fresh notes at the very least. There is an ethical problem with that in that with the interviews that I did, there's this principle of informed consent. So at the outset of the interview, I would sort of explain who I was, why I was there, what the research was all about, and this would all be on tape. And then sort of say to the person I was interviewing, are you happy with that? Are you okay to proceed with the interview? They would say yes, that would be on tape. At the end of the interview, I would say, okay, that's all the questions I've got. Is there anything you want to add? And then I'd say, for the tape, can I just confirm that you're still happy with me keeping what you've told me, and that you're happy with me using that in my research? There is an issue with that, especially when you're dealing with something that's quite contested like this, is that if someone's an activist and they start to realise that you're not going to support their position, Do they then have the right to sort of say, no, I'm not going to let you use the information, the interview information? By and large, the ethical guidelines of the Association of Social Anthropologists says you should respect their wishes. But I think where you're dealing with people who fully understand the issues involved, I think there is flexibility on this, especially when you're dealing with something that's quite politicised. So, although no one actually did turn around and say to me, no, I'm not letting you use what I've told you, I probably would have sort of said something along the lines of, what you've told me is on my records now. I make an undertaking that I will not deliberately quote you out of context to make you look bad in any way, but I think there is an ethical basis for going ahead and using that information, even though you may regret having given it me now, to ensure that there is better understanding of this situation. Now, I don't know if that's going to put me at odds with the ASA, but I think to make that ongoing informed consent an absolute makes it very hard to undertake well-founded and preferably fairly unbiased research within a politicised setting. Because how can it be unbiased if one of the stakeholders, one of the people with a particular perspective can say, no, you can't say anything, that you can't use some of the data that disagrees with me.
Obviously, just to add to that, it might link into what you were saying earlier, Miguel, in that it's what about, if you would be entering a community or an interview environment, is it also about the presentation of yourself as an independent researcher? I mean, how much would that affect? I mean, how would you go about actually when you enter a room or with a tape recorder? I mean, it's
well, that's a good point. Where you've got a huge gathering of lots and lots of people, are you expected to stand there with a megaphone and say, I'm a researcher here, I'm doing this and this, anyone who doesn't approve of me can avoid me or whatever? There's a principle that if something is in the public domain already, then you don't need to announce yourself. You don't need to have a big sort of hat with researcher on the top. If you're in a public space that anyone can go into, with a camera or whatever. Where it gets slightly more complicated is if you're at one of these camps where it's a ticket-only event, where people who might be deemed hostile might not get a ticket. Then I think there is a case for sort of trying to make sure that as many people know who you are, what you're about, as possible, or as is feasible. And definitely when you're doing one-to-one interviews, I think it's important to be open and upfront about who you are and why you're doing it. I think that's ethically important. Although, again, there is an argument that may prejudice some of the information that you're going to get, possibly.
Especially, I think, with why you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
People might immediately take against you when you say that.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other questions?
I was going to ask you, when you're writing your research, you're doing the interviews, but then you're writing it. Do you find that the reflections and the approaches, you find them changing quickly, like when you're gathering the data and then when you put it sort of in order? Do you find that as a sort of source itself of reflection, and do you find the writing itself like helping you to deal with, for example, future interviews while you're doing?
Yes, definitely. And analysing and getting things down in writing, it always, for me at least, helps me sort of process, go through things within my own mind. But it also sort of brings the idea of to what extent do ideas and attitudes change ongoing. And this, I think, harks back a little bit to Dave's point. When I first started the research, I was actually rather more sympathetic to the Ribeiro campaigners than I was by the time I finished. And that was, I think it was less about individual items of data, but more sort of really interrogating some of the underlying philosophical approaches regarding sort of things like totalitarianism, and to what extent do we expect other people who may not share our beliefs, our prejudices or whatever, to nevertheless act on them. And by the end of the research, I felt that definitely some of the Ribeiro campaigners, the ones who were more sort of direct action based, I felt that they were to some extent acting in a rather totalitarian way, in that they were expecting people who didn't share their beliefs to act as though they did. So that was a sort of change that took place through. I mean, does that answer your question effectively?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you all very much for listening to me. I hope this has been useful to you.
Yes.
And, you'll probably see me around campus a fair bit. So if anyone does want to sort of have a chat and sort of exchange ideas or whatever, do feel free to come up and buy me a cup of tea.